Plato. In the standard but somewhat simplified picture of the great period of philosophy in the classical antiquity realm, the figures of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle make a kind of trinity by lineage, Plato being the pupil of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle. This is true, but stated thus baldly it might mislead. Plato was one of Socrates' devoted acolytes, and is named as one of the young men whom Socrates allegedly corrupted by his teaching. But remember that Socrates' method was not conventionally didactic. He did not lecture and instruct, but inquired and discussed. He did not have a school. He did not offer himself as anyone's teacher. Plato, by contrast, founded an academic institution, and it had a curriculum. A condition of entry was knowledge of mathematics. And Plato himself had a wide-ranging, deep, and interconnected set of views, which he taught and which his most notable pupil, Aristotle, engaged with him. In his own turn, he founded a school and lectured to pupils in it. Plato existed from 425 to 347 BCE, and came from a wealthy and aristocratic family. Because of his celerity, his biography soon became encrusted with legends. It was said that he was descended from early kings of Athens and from one of the 7 sages, and that when he was an infant, bees settled on his lips as an augury of the honeyed words that would later flow from them. It is certainly the case that he was well connected. Many of the characters who appear in his dialogues are relatives, and many of these held leading positions in the political life of Athens. But he says little about himself, and even his name might be a pseudonym. It is thought that he might have been named Aristocles by his family, and that Plato, from Platon, or meaning broad, was a nickname bestowed either by his wrestling master because of his sturdy frame or by admirers for the breadth of his teaching. Partly, no doubt, because of his aristocratic heritage, Plato was an opponent of the Athenian democracy, whose failings resulted in the city's defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, written about by Thucydides. He was also a vigorous opponent of the concept of democracy itself. Socrates' trial and execution were most probably the result of political turmoil in the years after Athens' defeat in 404 BCE. Socrates was executed in 399, and Plato's belief that political chaos must inevitably result in tyranny, because a tyrant would step in to restore order, only makes matters worse, thereby underlay his view that the state should be run by philosopher kings, living in a monk-like freedom from the corrupting influences of wealth-seeking and family ties that could warp their judgment. It has been suggested that Plato's early writings were contributions not to philosophy, but to literature. But this is a suggestion advanced by Gilbert Ryle of Oxford in his Plato's Progress, written in 1966. Not only athletics, but dialogue competitions were held at the games that were major periodic events in Greek cultural life. The Panathenaic Games, the Olympic Games, and others. The suggestion is that Plato's early aporetic dialogues did not aim at philosophical conclusions because that was not their point. His writings are admired as much for their aesthetic qualities as for their intellectual content, and it is their style rather than the conclusions they reach which most distinguishes his earliest works. On this view, it was only after the death of Socrates that Plato became more seriously interested in the philosophical ideas he had hitherto been using as vehicles for his literary ambitions. Although some of the philosophers of antiquity were pure theoreticians, ivory tower academics, as might be said today, many were engaged in the practical and political lives of their city-states. Plato did not take an active part in Athenian politics after Socrates' death, but he had a long-standing interest in the Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily, to which he was 3 times invited by its rulers to advise on its government. He accepted the invitations because he was friendly with Dion, who became ruler of Syracuse, following a rebellion. Dion was a disciple and admirer of Plato, and he offered the philosopher a chance to put his ideas about government into practice. In the event, Dion proved to be a poor ruler, and his period in office, during which he sought to establish a Platonic aristocracy, bequeathed a legacy of turmoil and failure that lasted for decades afterwards. To say that the fault lay with Plato's ideas and the advice he gave would only be partly true. The intractable materials of human nature and economic reality, and Dion's own failings, doubtless had parts to play that were as large or larger. Plato's philosophy is a system, or at least it aspired to be one. He was too self-critical for the aspiration to be fully realizable. Its different components were meant to fit together to provide answers to the fundamental questions that he, more clearly and more comprehensively than his predecessors, saw had to be answered so that all the answers together make sense. Those questions are, what is the right kind of life and the best kind of society? What is knowledge and how do we get it? What is the fundamental nature of reality? You might note that these questions have an order. To answer the first, you need to answer the second. To answer the second, you need to answer the third. Of course, Socrates got us to think for ourselves. He opened our minds to the life worth living. Many philosophers after Plato likewise recognized that to answer the great questions of ethics, one has to answer questions about the nature of the world and humanity in it, and therefore of how we can acquire knowledge about both. And that means we have to find answers to a number of sub-questions, for example, to understand knowledge and how we get it. We have to have views about truth and reason, about the powers and therefore the nature of the mind, and about its relationship to the rest of reality. Almost the whole of philosophy consists in approaches to the related set of questions addressed by Plato. It is because Plato identified them and the way they connect with each other that Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematician and philosopher who collaborated with Bertrand Russell on the Principia Mathematica, said that, quote, philosophy is footnotes to Plato, end quote. That is an exaggeration, but not too much of one, for indeed almost all the major questions of philosophy are addressed or at the very least touched upon by Plato, in comparison not just to what went before in the history of philosophy, but to all that followed. Plato's achievement is vast, a mountain towering over foothills. One way to enter Plato's philosophy is by noting the import of an analogy he uses to describe how things are for human beings, so far as their understanding of the world and life is concerned. This is the allegory of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic. We are like prisoners held in a cave, chained so that we face the cave's back wall. Behind us and between us, and the tunnel that leads out of the cave, is a fire. Our captors walk up and down between our backs and the fire, casting shadows. On the rear wall of the cave, we see the shadows. If we were released from our chains, we would see the fire and the preambulating captors, and therefore would understand the source of the shadows. But if we were allowed out of the cave and saw the daylight, and above all the sun, we would know things as they truly are. Most people, says Plato, are like the prisoners watching shadows. Some attain to the level of understanding possible for a prisoner free enough to move about the cave, but the goal is to step into the sunlight and to see the truth in its full glory. How is it possible to do that? We get the first indications in the Meno, an important dialogue in that it marks the move away from Socratic inconclusiveness, with at best negative answers to the questions being addressed, and on towards Plato's provision of positive answers. Remember that Socrates had identified virtue with knowledge, and that therefore the question, what is knowledge and how do we get it, becomes crucial for understanding what the best life should be. So, how do we acquire knowledge? Plato had been persuaded by his philosophical predecessors, the pre-Socratic philosophers, not least by Parmenides, that the senses are delusive and do not reveal to us the true nature of reality. Therefore, to have knowledge, we must have a means of acquiring it, which does not depend on the senses. At most and at best, the senses can only give us opinions about the world they reveal to us, a world consisting of a plurality of transitory and perfect things. Whatever else the objects of genuine knowledge must be, they cannot be like this. They must be eternal, perfect, and unchanging, for Plato, thus possessed of at least some of the essential characteristics Parmenides specified as essential to what truly exists. To deal with this, Plato puts forward the following thesis. There are, he argued, two realms, the realm of being, inhabited by perfect and unchanging things, and the realm of becoming, which is the world offered to us by our senses. The world of imperfect and temporary things, always changing, always becoming something else, hence the name. Things in the realm of becoming are imperfect copies of the things in the realm of being. These latter things are the forms, also called ideas, which are the exemplars and paradigms for the many imperfect and temporary copies of them in the realm of becoming. The forms are eternal, perfect, and unchanging. They are the real reality of what the world of sense experience is merely a shadow. We are not capable of inferring the existence of the forms from their imperfect copies, given our delusive powers of perception and our finite intellects. Therefore, there must be another way we know them. This is what we have Plato has the idea of immortal souls, which, while in their disembodied state before we were born, occupy the realm of being in our indirect contact with the forms, and therefore, while in that state, we know everything. But when our souls enter our bodies, they forget everything. The process of education is the process of being partially reminded of what we knew in our disembodied state, literally of unforgetting what we knew when disembodied. Unforgetting is literally what the word anamnesis means in Greek. This view is known in English as the theory of recollection. The theory of recollection is demonstrated in the Meno by the example of an ignorant slave boy from whom Socrates elicits a geometrical proof by reminding him of what his immortal soul once knew. Critics point out that Socrates' questions are rather artfully phrased, and that any clever boy might have been able to construct the proof with their help. But the example is intended to show how knowledge of virtue can be gained, more accurately, regained, by such prompting. In the Symposium, we are given an account of how this works. Love of another's beauty can be a royal road to love of beauty, instead, and thence to intellectual love of the highest beauty of all, which is the good. In the allegory of the cave, the good is represented by the sun. In the Meno, discussion of several important ideas emerge. One concerns the difference between knowledge and true belief. Suppose someone believes that one can get to a certain town by a certain route, and is right about it. Suppose he just happens to be right. He has never been there himself, but thinks he remembers something, or someone, saying that this is the route. So he has a true belief about the route, but you cannot say he knows it, because his reason for believing it is not a good one. If he had been there himself, or had consulted an authoritative map, he could claim to know the route. Plato distinguishes between knowledge and a correct belief by saying that the latter, the correct belief, becomes knowledge when it is tied down, that is, has a satisfactory justification. Plato's theory requires acceptance of the view that we have souls and that they are immortal. Obviously, arguments to this effect are presented in the Phaedo, a dialogue appropriately set in Socrates' prison cell shortly before he is due to drink the hemlock. Here, the logical order of dependence between knowledge, the doctrine of the forms, and the doctrine of recollection is rearranged to make the fact that we know some things count as reason for taking the soul to be immortal, given that we could not know those things otherwise. There are two other arguments in the Phaedo for the soul's immortality. One is that the soul is like the forms, that is, it is not a physical, empirical, structured thing, but an immaterial, single, or unitary thing, and therefore, like the forms, it must be eternal and indestructible. And of course, it thereby satisfies, like them, the Parmenidean requirements for being real. The final argument is that the concept of the soul is incompatible with the concept of death. The soul is a thing of life. When death approaches, it escapes, or otherwise its very nature would be negated. These are not satisfactory arguments, and one notes that they turn in the first place on the assumption that there is such a thing as a soul. What then is a soul? The Phaedo does not give a clear answer beyond assuming that it is distinct from the body and survives the body's death. At one point, Plato lists many things that the body does and says that by contrast, the soul has just one activity, namely reasoning. That seems odd, because if there were such things as souls, it would seem plausible to ascribe the rest of mental life to them too, such as remembering, hoping, intending, desiring, and more. At another point, however, Plato appears to identify the soul with the personhood of its possessor. When Socrates is asked how he wants to be buried, he says, in effect, I am not my body, it is not me who will be buried. In Book 4 of the Republic, a somewhat more elaborate theory of the soul is advanced. Here Plato says that the soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. With the first, reason, we learn and pursue truth by rational inquiry. With the second, spirit, we feel emotions such as anger or determination, and this is the part of us that seeks honor. While the third, appetite, focuses upon such bodily desires as food, wine, and sex. In the Phaedrus, Plato offers an account of the way we can sometimes be conflicted with ourselves because the different parts of the soul pull in different directions. He likens us to a flying chariot with the driver and two horses. The driver is reason, one of the horses is spirit, the other is appetite. Appetite tries to pull the chariot down to earth, while spirit seeks to obey reason's aim of taking it to the heavens. The charioteer has to struggle with the opposing forces thus represented. Plato gives more practical examples of this in the Republic, one of which is of a man who desires to fulfill a certain appetite but is angry with himself for having that appetite. These are the main outlines of Plato's system. They are fully present in the best known of his works, the Republic. This is a dialogue about justice, and it uses the analogies that can be drawn between a person and a polis, or a state, to illustrate the virtue of justice in each, justice being achieved when balance or harmony between the aspects of the state is achieved, analogously with balance or harmony among the aspects of the soul. Book 1 of the Republic is thought by some scholars to be an early Socratic dialogue of the familiar Alenchus Aporia type, and the latter books to be additions and expansions made by Plato as he developed a positive theory. This is because in the first book, Socrates' interlocutors offer definitions of justice. One says, quote, "It is the art of doing good to friends and harm to enemies," end quote, and the other, Thrasymachus, says that it is whatever the strong wish to do, and Socrates shows that they are each unsatisfactory. But then in Book 2, others take up the consideration of Thrasymachus' point, variously, arguing that justice arises from the social contracts put in place to protect the weak against the strong, and that unjust men will not be punished because they can use their injustices to grow rich enough to make pleasing sacrifices to the gods, who will therefore forgive them. This prompts Socrates to suggest that instead of thinking to define the just individual, they should see what is meant by justice in the state. In latter books, the ideas worked out for what would make an ideal state are applied to what would make a just person. The main thesis of the Republic is that the ideal society would be one that is ruled by guardians or philosopher kings, chosen when children for their intelligence, and carefully and thoroughly raised so that, on reaching adulthood, they can fulfill the role of incorruptibility or incorruptible, virtuous, dispassionate, and wise rulers. This allows Socrates to take a detour into discussion of an ideal education. The chief idea is that children should be brought up by the state in ignorance of who their biological parents are. The state will decide which men and women should mate on grounds of suitability, a form of eugenics. As the children grow up in the state, in nurseries, they will be separated into 3 groups: those suitable for training as guardians, those suitable for training as warriors, and the rest. Both males and females can be guardians and should receive the same training. They should be educated in the virtues of wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage. They should be physically well trained in gymnastics to ensure good health. They should have no private property so that there are no temptations to accumulate more, and wives should be shared to prevent partiality. They should live and eat with moderation. Plato's ideal state is an aristocracy, a state ruled by the best. The term aristocrat did not then mean an hereditary social caste or caste, but in fact is better understood as meritocrat, denoting the best of the citizens in respect of intellect and virtue. If the virtues are expressed by all degrees of citizens in the appropriate way, the state will be happy. The guardians will be wise, the auxiliaries courageous, everyone will be temperate, and the government will be just. Harmony will prevail, and this is the key for the analogy between the state and the individual. For if harmony prevails likewise within the individual, he will be virtuous likewise. I do mention here that it is the idea of Plato that the best and the most just society will be a society in which everyone does that which they are best at. In Book 8, Plato describes a set of political systems in order of merit, beginning with the kind he advocates and descending to the worst kind, namely tyranny. He regards tyranny as the worst form of government because, as Lord Acton long afterwards noted, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If power lies in the hands of a single individual, its arbitrary exercise can do great harm. Between aristocracy as the ideal arrangement and tyranny as the worst, there are several intermediate forms. In the ideal arrangement, the state is governed by the most knowledgeable, virtuous, and wise of the citizens, whose rule is disinterested because, as noted, they have no vested interests in anything but the welfare of the state. The next best form is epistocracy, ruled by those who know, in other words, by experts. The difference between aristocracy and epistocracy is that in the ideal state, the rulers are not merely experts, they are virtuous experts. They have expertise in the nature of the good as well as in government and other practical matters. Plato wished his rulers to be virtuous and disinterested, with no ambitions other than to rule wisely, in order to prevent the state from degenerating into a timocracy. Like I said before, we have these cardinal virtues, the virtues of wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage. In modern parlance, democracy is ruled by those who have a certain minimum of property, but in Plato's usage, it denotes rule by those who seek honor, status, and military glory. Ambition for these things reveals a mistaken confusion of the good with its outer shows, wealth and reputation being erroneously regarded as the greatest goods worth having. Whereas aristocracy would ensure stable government because no inner divisions threaten it, with democracy and the other less satisfactory forms of the state, rivalry enters the picture, and with rivalry comes instability. Democracy can easily become oligarchy, by which Plato meant rule by the rich over the more numerous poor. This form of oligarchy, ruled by a few, is nowadays called plutocracy. Democracy degenerates into oligarchy because timocrats are permitted to accumulate wealth, from which follow the vices encouraged by wealth, pursuit of pleasure and luxury, and belief that the accumulation of wealth is more important than virtue. Timocrats might care about honor, said Plato, but oligarchs care only about money. And the inevitable result will be democracy, for Plato a term of malediction. The rich enjoy freedom because their wealth buys it for them. Envy of that freedom causes oligarchy to be overcome by democracy. The populace, or the demos, rises against the oligarchs in order to dispose them, often with violence and turmoil. But when in democracy everyone claims the freedom and the right to make and break laws, what soon follows, said Plato, is anarchy, for such freedom is not freedom but merely license. Implicit in the idea of a decision from the ideal form of government is Plato's claim that the demos, or the people, lacks the knowledge and virtue that philosopher kings would have, and which is what makes them fit to govern. He thinks that the collapse of the democratic state into anarchy is inevitable given the supposed characteristics of the polloi, or the general public: ignorance, self-interest, prejudice, envy, and rivalry. Anarchy very soon invites the intervention of a strong man to restore order. Given the insupportable nature of anarchy, he will be welcomed at first with open arms. Once he is in power, removing him can be difficult, and the people will be in the worst situation of all. They will live under tyranny. Just as the best state is ruled by wisdom and virtue, so the best kind of life is lived by the person who rules himself or herself by wisdom and virtue likewise. Plato's idea of justice is balance, or harmony. Balance between the three orders of people in the state. Balance between the three parts of the soul and individual. The different kinds of state have their analogies in different kinds of people. Those ruled by wisdom and virtue, those driven by desire for honor, those driven by desire for wealth, those ruled by ignorance and unruly passions. The Republic is something of a high point in Plato's philosophy, bringing together his metaphysics of the forms, his epistemology of recollection, and his ethical conception of virtue as knowledge into a system that provides a view of both the good individual and the good state. Other thinkers might have felt justifiably pleased with themselves for having worked out such an interlocking system and its comprehensive application to key questions. But Plato did not rest content. His thinking continued to develop after the Republic, and he came to challenge his own most significant ideas, both the theory of the forms and his theory of knowledge. In doing so, he took the philosophical examination of these matters to new levels. In Plato's philosophy, the forms in the realm of being are real things. They are not mental objects only. They are beauty, truth, goodness, but what they are also: man, tree, horse, mountain, and everything else. Although Plato was somewhat conflicted over whether there are forms of such things as hair and dirt, faces that are beautiful because the beauty in them participates in or is an imperfect copy of the form of beauty. A mountain is a mountain because it likewise participates in or is a copy of the form of mountain. To begin to see that there is much that is problematic here, note first that participate in and copy are two quite different notions. Which did Plato mean? To understand why this question takes the lid off a major philosophical problem, consider the important distinction between things like tables, apples, aircraft, and rabbits, and the properties that things might have, such as being white, red, flat, or round. We speak naturally about many things having the same property. This tablecloth is red, that apple is red, that person's nose is red. This seems to suggest that there is something redness that all these particular things share or have in common. Redness being the essence of what makes something what it is. Tablecloths and apples are called particulars, and properties such as redness and flatness are called universals, because many particulars can exemplify them. In philosophy, long after Plato's time during the late medieval period, the schoolmen, as the philosophers of that period were collectively known, see the section on medieval philosophy, if you want to be interested in the kind of medieval views, the views of Augustine, being heavily influenced by Plato, the views of, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, who picked up on Aristotle. Nevertheless, these schoolmen were deeply divided over the question of whether universals really exist, or whether words like redness and flatness are just names that we give to similarities we see between different particulars. Some of the schoolmen said that universals are real things. There really is redness in the universe, existing apart from individual red things, and that it would exist even if there were no red things. They are accordingly called realists. Others denied that the universals really exist and regarded redness as merely a name that we use for our descriptive convenience. Hence, from name, they are called nominalists. The realism-nominalism debate was one of the most hotly contested questions in medieval philosophy. Plato, as we see, was a realist about the forms, but he was a realist also about the difficulties that the concept of the forms raises. He addresses these difficulties in the Parmenides, where he has the elderly Parmenides challenging a young Socrates to defend the theory, and Socrates finding considerable difficulty in doing so. Both the idea of particular things participating in the forms and the quite different notion that particulars resemble or are copies of the forms comes under Parmenides' scrutiny. First, Parmenides asks Socrates what kinds of things have forms. Beauty and goodness, yes. Relations like equality and plurality, yes. Man and fire and water, yes. Mud, hair, dirt, no. In fact, Socrates gives an answer to the question whether man and fire have forms that is different from the answer he gives about beauty and equality. And his negative answer about mud and dirt is puzzling, given that according to the metaphysics behind the theory of forms, the fact that a particular goblet of mud is mud is or should be because it has participants and copies. Mudness, or if one were not metaphysically too snobbish to allow this, the form of mud. For if this boot is muddy and that boot is muddy, they both have the property of being muddy. So there is not a respect in which they both therefore share, have, or exemplify muddiness. Or is there not a respect in which they both therefore share, have, or exemplify muddiness? If this matter is left in an unsatisfactory state, then Parmenides tackles participates in. Plato sometimes says shares in or shares. If a particular apple is red because it shares in the form of redness, does it have a little bit of the form in it, or is the form fully in it? Is the form divided into as many bits as there are things to share it, or is it in some other way participated in or shared by many things while still itself being one? Socrates suggests in reply that one should think of a form as one thinks of a day. The same day is present in many places, but it is still one thing. This leaves unspecified the nature of the relation of participating in. How is redness something separate from this particular apple and that particular apple, and not of the same kind or nature as physical particulars like apples, given that it is not something in space and time, nevertheless, in each of the apples? It might seem more plausible to opt for the resemblance or the resembles or copies option, because at least that is a more intelligible notion. But here the third man problem arises, so-called because in Aristotle's discussion of the argument, he uses the example of an individual man's relation to the form of man. The problem is as follows. A man is a man because he resembles the form of a man. Both he and the form share manness. Now, there are two possibilities. One is that the man in the form of man, called this later man form one, are similar in virtue of something that makes them similar, which would be their each resembling another, more comprehensive form of man. Call it man form two. But if they each resemble that form, there would have to be yet a more comprehensive form, man form three, in virtue of which the resemblance between the man and the man form one resembles man form two, and so on ad infinitum. The alternative is to argue that there has to be one form for each particular to be a copy of, requiring therefore an infinite or at least indefinitely large number of individual forms. But this not only is implausible and unnecessarily duplicating each individual thing. Why is each individual not its own form, dispensing with a parallel universe or of individual forms, but fails to solve the problem that the theory is offered to solve, how different particulars can have or share the same property? The first alternative assumes that the forms self-predicate, that is, apply to themselves. The form of beauty is itself beautiful, the form of largeness is itself large, the form of man is itself a man. The result, as we see, is regress. The second alternative offers an even less compelling solution. Yet Plato did not give up the theory, even though he could not find a satisfactory response to these challenges. In a very late dialogue, the Timaeus, the theory is still alive. He uses it in his account of how the creator of the universe, the demiurge, or divine craftsman, uses the forms to make the plurality of individual copies of them, which constitute the world. Plato also questioned his own theory of knowledge. This occurs in one of the most challenging of his dialogues, the Theaetetus. Note first that there are three ways one can think of knowledge, as knowledge that something is the case, knowledge how to do something, and knowledge in the sense of knowing X, being acquainted with X, as when one says, I know New York, or I know Fred. Plato often speaks as if his basic notion of knowledge is the last of these three, which would make sense in light of the theory of forms, because what the Meno and the Republic tell us is that knowledge pertains exclusively to the forms. We only have opinions and beliefs regarding everything else, and accordingly knowledge is acquaintance with the forms. On this view, just as we say, I know New York, we could say, I know beauty, or I know truth. But in the Theaetetus, the forms do not appear. Instead, the discussion focuses on three theories: that knowledge is acquired through sense perception, that it is true belief, and that it is true belief with a justification. The first theory is rejected on the grounds that knowledge involves judging, which is an activity of mind, not the senses. This prepares the way for the next two theories, both based on the idea that knowledge is judgment, or belief under certain conditions. The word doxa, translated in the Greek as both belief and judgment. The second theory is that knowledge is true belief, or knowledge is a justified true belief. As we saw in the argument of Meno, Plato rejects this, but here adds a detour into the question of how false belief is possible. In the Meno, Plato makes the point that one can have beliefs which are true, but which we cannot claim as knowledge because our reasons for holding the belief are not the right ones to count as knowledge. This point recurs in the Theaetetus and leads to the third theory, which is that knowledge is true judgment with a justification or account, a logos. That knowledge is a true judgment or a justified statement concerning a certain aspect of a thing. The effort to specify what kind of logos turns a belief into knowledge is inconclusive. Socrates ends by saying to the young Theaetetus, quote, and so, Theaetetus, knowledge is neither sensation nor true opinion, nor yet definition and explanation accompanying and adding to true opinion. A recurrence of aphoria. But in exploring what the required logos might be, Plato initiates a long and detailed philosophical debate about the nature of knowledge which has lasted to our own day. For in our own day, the definition of knowledge as justified true belief, Plato's third option, still bedevils us with questions about the nature of that justification, to say nothing of questions about what truth is. There is a mystery attached to Plato in one respect, relating to the idea that he taught an unwritten doctrine, grapha dogmata, that is, views about that he did not commit to writing, but kept privately within the circle of his pupils. Aristotle alludes to the existence of such views in his Physics, and many centuries later, Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, seems to have known them, or about them, or had surmises about what they were. Recent scholars of the Tübingen school of Platonic studies have attempted a reconstruction of them, saying that Plato reserved his views for his pupils about the ultimate principles of things, of which there are two, that reality is one, and that it manifests itself through the action upon it of something called the indefinite dyad, which is variously the large and the small, the lack and the excess, the ambiguous and the definite, and so on. That is, opposites, which act on the one and produce all reality from it as a result. It is further suggested that the one is the good. Aristotle reported that Plato lectured on the good, and in the written doctrines, the form of the good is nominated as the highest form, so the identification would be plausible. But this, and indeed the entire speculation about an unwritten doctrine, is controversial. Aristotle speaks not of an unwritten doctrine, but of the so-called unwritten doctrine. He speaks not of an unwritten doctrine, but of the so-called unwritten doctrine. Did he employ the phrase so-called neutrally, or was he thereby casting cold water on the belief that there was such a thing? Yet in others of his writings, for example, the Metaphysics, Aristotle refers to ideas of Plato that do not appear in the later's text. And one notes that Plato's immediate successors as heads of the Academy, first Speusippus and then Xenocrates, appear to have developed the ideas about the one and a principle whose opposition to it generates reality. Speusippus, I'm sorry, I mispronounced that word. Speusippus talks of plurality and Xenocrates of inequality. Was there an unwritten doctrine, and if so, was it esoteric and kept within the circle of disciples because it was too precious to be made public? Some folk like that kind of suggestion. It gives a frisson, a vague promise of deep, dark secrets. Much more likely is the fact that what was discussed in academy seminars ranged widely and ideas were explored that did not happen to find their way into a written record, and that Plato advanced more thoughts than he found occasion to develop in a dialogue for publication. That would be wholly consistent with what has happened and still happens today in philosophical discussions everywhere. The school founded by Plato, the Academy, lasted nearly 800 years until 529 CE. In that year, the Roman Emperor Justinian, a Christian, abolished it and banned the teaching of pagan philosophy because it was inconsistent with Christian doctrine. But its long history before that saw a number of philosophically significant changes and developments. About 80 years after Plato's death, the Academy fell under the influence of skepticism, prompting Cicero to rename it the New Academy. Historians of philosophy accept this label and treat the skeptical phase as lasting until 90 BCE, when Antiochus of Ascalon rejected the skeptical teaching he had received from Philo of Larissa at the Academy. Thus commenced Middle Platonism, a stage in which Plato's doctrines were modified by the introduction of elements of Aristotelian and Stoic thought. Middle Platonism lasted until Plotinus in the 3rd century CE developed the Platonic tradition into the powerful school of thought that historians call Neoplatonism. The immediate consequence of Plato and of one of the greatest legacies that he bequeathed must, however, be accounted his star pupil, Aristotle, who disagreed with his teacher, combining with his own genius, constituting the next major step in the history of philosophy.